he would work with mayors to make sure that we have the necessary investments to continue to do the work that we have been doing.
MSNBC did not hold back when turning its focus onto Mayor Brandon Johnson's record in Chicago. The network, known for its often sharp political commentary, carved into his time in office with a tone that was more unforgiving than analytical. What began as a discussion of urban governance, crime rates, and public trust quickly transformed into a pointed takedown of Johnson's leadership style and the results of his administration. The anchors and panelists pulled no punches, framing his tenure as an experiment gone wrong in a city that could not afford failure. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. From the opening segments, the critique was less about speculation and more about performance. Chicago had been grappling with complex issues for decades: violence, budget struggles, educational inequities. But Johnson had entered the mayor's office with the promise of fresh ideas and progressive momentum. What MSNBC laid out, however, was a narrative where those promises collided with the stubborn realities of a city that has long defied easy solutions. The tone was almost surgical, dissecting policy moves, highlighting perceived failures, and painting a portrait of a mayor who, in their framing, had lost the confidence of many Chicagoans. The commentary zeroed in first on crime. For years, Chicago has been a national talking point when it comes to gun violence and public safety. Johnson had campaigned with strong language about rethinking policing, emphasizing investment in communities, youth programs, and alternatives to incarceration. But MSNBC's analysis framed these initiatives as either half-formed or ineffectively executed. They highlighted headlines about continued spikes in certain neighborhoods, anecdotal accounts of residents who felt less safe, and the perception that the city's government had failed to provide reassurance during times of crisis. To MSNBC, it wasn't just that crime numbers existed, it was that the mayor's responses often came across as ideological rather than pragmatic, further fueling the critique. The economic side of the city also became a central theme. Chicago's budget constraints are legendary, with pension obligations and debt looming for years. Johnson had campaigned on redistributive policies, pushing for new taxes aimed at wealthier residents and corporations. MSNBC portrayed these efforts as both politically divisive and economically questionable. The anchors debated whether such proposals risked pushing businesses and affluent families out of the city, thereby worsening the very revenue shortfalls Johnson aimed to solve. It was not presented as a nuanced argument, but as a bold assertion that his economic agenda was destabilizing rather than stabilizing. Education was another point of friction. Chicago public schools, long a battleground for mayors and unions alike, became symbolic of the broader tensions under Johnson's watch. MSNBC pointed to disagreements with the teachers' union, despite Johnson's own history as a union organizer, suggesting that the mayor's alignment with organized labor created conflicts of interest that prevented decisive leadership. The critique suggested he had struggled to balance the needs of students, parents, and teachers in a way that satisfied any of the groups, leaving a sense of stagnation instead of progress. The program's structure was deliberate. Each segment layered a new critique over the last, creating the impression of cumulative failure. What MSNBC seemed intent on conveying was not a single misstep, but a pattern. They painted Johnson as a leader who arrived with lofty rhetoric, but lacked the adaptability required to navigate crises and the pragmatism to build broad coalitions in a city with competing demands. It was this accumulation of issues, crime, economy, schools, and governance, that gave the takedown its force. Even Johnson's communication style did not escape scrutiny. MSNBC highlighted moments where his rhetoric seemed detached from the raw urgency of residents' concerns. The anchors replayed clips of speeches and interviews, underscoring a contrast between the mayor's words and the lived experiences of Chicagoans who continue to grapple with safety concerns and economic instability. This framing portrayed him as someone whose leadership tone was more aspirational than actionable, widening the gap between his administration and the public's patience. The political implications of this critique were hard to miss. Chicago is not only a major city but also a symbol in national politics, often used as shorthand in debates about urban crime, progressive governance, and racial justice. By destroying Johnson on air, MSNBC wasn't just evaluating one mayor, It was sending a broader message about the viability of progressive leadership in America's largest cities. The implication was that Chicago, under Johnson, had become a case study in the risks of prioritizing ideology over results. That framing carried weight beyond the city limits. Viewers across the country could interpret the coverage as a warning about what happens when campaign promises meet intractable urban realities. The critique wasn't aimed solely at Johnson. It extended to the larger political movement he represented. For MSNBC, this was a way to question whether progressive mayors could realistically deliver on transformative visions without alienating large swaths of their constituencies or worsening existing crises. The dynamic within the panel was also revealing. There was little attempt to balance the criticism with sympathy for the challenges Johnson inherited. Instead, the discussion leaned into the idea that leadership is about results, not excuses. This set a high bar, perhaps an unfair one, for a mayor who had not yet completed a full term but nonetheless had to grapple with systemic issues decades in the making. The absence of acknowledgement for these structural factors added to the sense of a merciless judgment. Chicago's unique place in the national imagination intensified the impact of MSNBC's coverage. The city has long been caricatured in political debates, often unfairly, but also seen as a bellwether of urban governance. To have a high-profile network frame Johnson's leadership as a collapse resonated beyond the local context, feeding narratives on both the left and right. Conservatives could seize on the critique as validation of their arguments about progressive failure, while moderates and liberals might see it as a call for course correction in urban politics. The intensity of MSNBC's takedown also reflected something about the media ecosystem itself. Networks thrive on strong narratives, and in this case, the story of a progressive mayor struggling under pressure provided a compelling storyline. The sharpness of the critique was not only about Johnson, but about television's need to capture attention and generate debate. The destruction was as much about performance as it was about substance, amplifying the perception of failure through the lens of cable news drama. The reaction within Chicago itself, at least as framed by MSNBC, was one of growing frustration. They highlighted polling numbers that suggested declining approval ratings, commentary from local journalists, and voices from residents expressing disappointment. By stitching these elements together, the program created an impression of a mayor increasingly isolated from his constituents, a leader whose honeymoon phase had long ended without the stability that usually follows. MSNBC also focused on the contrast between Johnson's campaign image and his mayoral reality. His rise to power had been celebrated as a new chapter for Chicago. A teacher, an organizer, someone deeply rooted in the city's progressive circles. That biography carried symbolic weight, promising a different approach to governance. But the network presented his story as one of disillusionment, where the very qualities that propelled him into office had failed to translate into effective administration. The coverage lingered on the symbolism of broken promises. Johnson had embodied hope for those seeking a move away from machine politics and centrist pragmatism. His election had been framed as a rejection of the status quo. MSNBC turned that narrative on its head, arguing that instead of breaking the cycle, Johnson had deepened cynicism by failing to meet the expectations he set. The destruction here was not just political, but also emotional, suggesting that dashed hopes can be more damaging than the absence of hope in the first place. The framing of his administration's failures also raised questions about the future of progressive governance in other cities. If Johnson, with his grassroots credibility and union backing, could not succeed in Chicago, what did that say about the broader movement? MSNBC's critique implicitly suggested that progressive mayors elsewhere might face similar fates, especially if they lean more on ideological purity than pragmatic problem-solving. This was not just an attack on one leader, but a cautionary tale for a generation of politicians inspired by his rise. The narrative of a city unraveling under his watch was stark, and MSNBC made little effort to soften it. Each segment reinforced the sense of urgency and dysfunction. Whether discussing rising concerns about safety on public transit, debates over property taxes, or disputes within City Hall, the program painted a consistent picture of a leader out of his depth. The repetition of this theme built a crescendo that left little room for nuance. What was most striking was how the takedown framed Johnson not as unlucky, but as unprepared. The suggestion was that he underestimated the difficulty of the role and overestimated the power of rhetoric to solve entrenched problems. This portrayal of naivety cut deeply, framing him not only as ineffective but as someone who had misjudged the very nature of leadership. The implications of this televised critique reverberate well beyond the studio. For Johnson, it adds another layer of challenge, as national media coverage can influence local perceptions and embolden political opponents. For Chicago, it raises questions about its ability to attract investment, retain residents, and maintain confidence in its governance. For progressives across the country, it forces reflection on whether their strategies can hold up under the relentless pressures of running major cities. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on MSNBC's criticism of Brandon Johnson's leadership? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.